What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're actually going to be talking to Nate from Negative Lab Pro. He's the creator and founder of Negative Lab Pro, and he's got a whole bunch of gems to share with us who scan our own film at home and then, convert it and also edit it after the fact. So go ahead and check this out. You'll see my friend Darren's on the call as well. He's a fellow photographer based in Canada, and he's got some great questions from Nate as well. All right, y'all. I hope you enjoy this video. We'll definitely learn a couple things.
Like, what are the biggest mistakes you see people making when they're starting to scan with Negative Lab Pro? Like when they're starting to input it in?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. We already talked about, the importance of the setup. Especially with DSLR scanning, I mean, there are just so many little pitfalls you can fall into with the setup that you have to kind of know ahead of time. I mean, I have like an article up on the forum that's about DSLR scanning best practices. I also have that up on negativelabpro.com/guide. There's a whole guide to, film scanning versus view scan or Silverfast or, any of these others. So I think that that's a big mistake is people not getting good output and then not realizing, well, the output can only be as good as the input. But I think sometimes it takes, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from trying and making mistakes, because, you'll try and you'll make a mistake and you'll say, well, hey, why is it like this? And then you'll learn from that. And okay, well, it is important that, I mask off all the light coming from around here. So I think that's a big mistake. I think the second big mistake is I think people can approach film with the wrong mental model. And this mental model that film is only one thing and can only look one way. And, it should look this certain way completely automatically. Everyone comes to film with kind of a different background. Some people come to it from the background of they've just used film scanners in the past. If the immediate result doesn't look exactly like the film scanner, they think that something's wrong, or they think that what the film scanner has done is a completely accurate rendition of the film, which isn't really even what a film scanner was ever meant to do, or a lab scanner was ever meant to do. I mean, a lab scan, like, everything is designed. I don't think people understand that. Everything is designed. Film is designed. The lab scanners were designed, and the software behind the lab scanners was designed. Every piece of it has been designed in a certain way. And so then really the question isn't, how do I get this to look like portraits should look, but more, what do I want this to look like, and how do I get that to happen? So, okay, like, I really like this particular, portrait look. Okay, well, how do I get this particular portrait look? Okay, well, let me think about, what are the tones like in this? Okay, what are the colors like? What's the color palette like? What color is the skin tone? When you start thinking about that, then you start actually having a mental model that'll help you achieve the results that you want, as opposed to thinking, why isn't this the way that it should naturally be? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Yeah, I like that gets into like the whole film color thing, and like, is there like an innate look to a certain kind of film?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like getting into that, like when you've got Portra, when you're scanning that, is there going to be like a real difference in Negative Lab Pro versus that, like at a traditional film lab? Like, are you going to have innately different results
Versus a film lab?
Yeah.
You could, yeah. I mean, that's the other thing, is that there's a lot of variables. There's the variable of how calibrated is the film lab scanner. There's a variable of what kind of equipment have I used, and is all of my setup correct? There's the variable of who was the lab technician the day that was working at that lab, and are they colorblind, or are they really good?
Are they hungover? Did they sleep?
Right. What did they do to the photo after it went through the lab scanner? I think it's interesting. I mean, some film labs will offer you the immediate right out of the scanner, and then one where they've actually manipulated it afterwards. I did a test, back when I was just getting started, where I sent a roll off to a film lab and asked for it both ways, asked for it direct out of the scanner, but then also like whatever they do to it afterwards. And they'd actually done a significant amount of editing to it afterwards. So So to say, oh, this should look exactly like I got from my film lab when it comes out, well, there's so many variables there. Now I can tell you, if you have a scan from a film lab and you go and do it yourself, you can, if you know what you're doing, you can make it look exactly the same, like literally exactly the same. Um, More or less. I mean, I say exactly, but you know what I mean? Like you can make it look indistinguishable in terms of the tones and the colors and everything else if you have the eye for it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's actually, that's actually a pretty good practice to try to do, especially when you're just getting started, is to take a roll that's already gone to a film lab, maybe that you like the way that they processed it, or maybe you didn't. I mean, either way is valuable. And then run it through Negative Lab Pro and use that as a way to learn, okay, if I like this look that's really rich, so I need to bring down the brightness, and so that the colors really feel this richness. Or I like this look that is really pushed and it's really bright. Okay, well I need to push up, and once you start to recognize that, then you can start to see, okay, these are the changes and adjustments I need to make. And I do try to get, the tone profiles are set up in such a way as to try to get the basics of the tone more or less similar to what you would expect through different processes. So like the lab standard tone profile is going to give that extra amount of contrast that you would expect that a lab scan will do. But it's just a design thing. I mean, lab scanners did that because that's what consumers wanted, that it looked better when it felt like there was this huge like pop of contrast than if it felt completely flat.
I want to ask about the actual like process leading up to the actual scan. It's funny, Darren mentioned something earlier about consistent scans, and that when I thought about that, I was like, oh, well, first of all, I know exactly what he's talking about, but second, exposure settings. I feel like that's the thing that I'm curious about. I usually just let my camera do whatever it wants to do, just because like I can't be that bothered. So the question first is like, is that a faux pas? And the second thing is, if it is bad to do that, how do you suggest people meter the actual image going through the camera?
Yeah. So the one consideration to think about, if you have, say you've got a whole roll and you're scanning that roll, if you just leave your camera on auto, or even auto plus plus one EV or whatever, you're going to end up with slightly different exposures for each of them. And that may not be an issue, except when it comes time to make images look similar to each other. And so Negative Lab Pro right now, there's this concept of sync scene, which takes the exact same interpretation and settings from one photo and applies it to other photos you have selected, and allows you to continue editing in Negative Lab Pro. So it's just like syncing everything in Lightroom, but with the added benefit that it also syncs all that metadata behind those settings, so that you can continue to edit Negative Lab Pro. So if you do that and you have a slightly different exposure between the two than when you scanned it, then the same settings are going to look different on one versus the other. You could go in and maybe adjust the exposure, and maybe, I've thought about, well, I could just do that for you. Probably I could just see from the metadata what the exposure values are for each of the photos, and then just make them all uniform.
Gotcha.
But it's easiest and simplest if you just have one and just keep it through the entire roll. And there's the information that is in the negative easily fits within the dynamic range of a digital camera. Easily fits. There's never a time where you're going to be like, oh man, like this is, I'm clipping my blacks and my whites on this because it's compressed, right? So that's not really going to be an issue, as long as you're somewhere in kind of that middle histogram range. Then you should be totally fine. Now, I always recommend going up just maybe a little bit, exposing just a little bit more than what your camera may indicate would be the right exposure. And there's kind of the whole expose to the right philosophy with digital cameras. I've heard it said that there are more bits within the right side of the histogram than the left side of the histogram because of the linear nature of the camera sensor. Other people have told me that that's completely not true. This is another one of those great like technical debates. Both sides agree that you should do this, but each side thinks it's for a different reason.
Yeah.
So one side says, oh, it's because because like every you're doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, that there's just so many more layers of bits in this right side. The other side says, well, no, it's not really that. It's just that the signal to noise ratio, if you want to get as much signal in your data with the least amount of noise. And so if you don't, the more you push to the right, the greater the ratio is between the signal and the noise.
Okay.
In either case, both sides say, expose a little bit to the right, and you'll get more, you'll get a little bit more usable data out of it.
I want to ask you, you mentioned, you briefly said you had an Epson scanner, and then you kind of very quickly started talking about digital cameras. Do you think there's one that's better than the other for the digital, like the modern digital process, especially one that involves Negative Lab Pro?
Well, so the evolution of Negative Lab Pro has also kind of included the evolution of the scanning workflow. And, when I first launched Negative Lab Pro, it was really with a digital camera scanning in mind. But a lot of people came to me and said, man, I really want this for my scanning workflow, whether it's an Epson or a Nikon or Canon, or even things like a FlexTight, like a Hasselblad or like a Pacon. I said, I really want the same workflow for it. How can I do that? And yeah, so that's kind of opened up a whole nother category of stuff. When you talk about doing raw DNGs with your scanner, which is something that you can do with both ViewScan and with Silverfast, is you can actually get a raw scan where the data is untouched. It's linear, it's untouched, and it has the ability for me to create profiles for the scanners that are being interpreted in raw inside of Lightroom, which is pretty cool. So I would say, like, from if you're just talking about color, I think that you can get equally good colors from either solution.
Yeah.
In terms of speed, I think that a digital camera is still king, especially with some of the tools that are out now that that either advance on their own, or you can twist a little knob and it'll advance kind of perfectly in frame. I mean, I can go through a roll of 35 millimeter. I can go through it in faster than my Pacon can, and go through it in like a minute or two.
Yeah, of course.
But you do get, there is something there is something nice about the way that a good scanner looks, especially on medium format and large format. I'll take some of my medium format shots on my Epson V600, and they just look so good. Just the detail just looks very natural. You don't have to think about the demosaicing of the either the Bayer filter array or the X-Trans filter for the Fujis. I mean, it's just very natural. Yeah. And so I understand that people who still like to use a film scanner, and I still like to use a film scanner. But for most, I would say my preferred method, just for the speed, has got to be a digital camera.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's incredible that you're able to get like this much detail out of a DSLR scan. Like, if you're using that kind of thing, do you even need to like upgrade to like an A7R4 or one of these high resolution cameras to get the most of the negatives, or like can people just use like their 5D Mark II that's still in their closet or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things is definitely going to be the macro lens, and having a really good macro lens, especially the newer macro lenses are better suited than some of the older style macro lenses. They've gotten really good with the technology in terms of how they coat the macro lenses now, to where they're not picking up reflection and glare. And reflection and glare can be a big problem with DSLR scanning, because you're taking this lens and you're putting it right next to a direct light source and shooting directly into it. So these older lenses that don't have a good coating, you end up with all kinds of like blobs and discolorations, and you're like, where's all this stuff coming from? It's coming because you're shooting directly at a light source and you're getting flare from it. So having a really good one-to-one modern macro lens with a good UV coating and good coating on it is I think the first most important thing to get. Because if you don't have that, it doesn't matter what your resolution is. You're just going to have very good resolution of a bad scan.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like one of the first things that people do when they're getting into like DSLR scanning is that they use extension tubes. I know that like I started with that as well and like didn't get great results, but like is it possible to get good results with extension tubes?
If it is, I mean, I haven't seen it. I get, I would say, you know, a lot of the emails and a lot of the posts, either on the forum or in the Facebook group, and people have had bad results. You know, it usually comes down to, you know, well, let's hear about your setup.
Mhm.
And it usually comes down to, you know, oh, I'm using, you know, an old lens on an extension tube with an LED I picked up on Amazon for like $5. It's like, well, okay, well, you know, you're building, the cool thing about DSLR is you're getting to build your own system. So you can choose to build it that way, but you can't build it that way and then expect that you're not going to run into issues. So I think a lot of people maybe start with the extension tubes and kind of like proof of concept. Okay, I can, this could be cool, but it's not quite there yet. And if you're super careful with everything else, and you have all other light blocked out, and you have you know, you have the light blocked out on the LED itself that's not going directly through, you can get away with it somewhat, but it's just going to be such a more fickle setup. It's just going to be so much more prone to headache, than if you just got a good macro lens.
Yeah. So film itself, like there used to be a time when you would get like a daylight film and a tungsten film, right? But now film, it can work in almost all spectrums, really. So like, how flexible are the films themselves before they even get into Negative Lab Pro?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the film. Some films, at least in my experience, are more flexible than other films, or tend to produce results easier. Um, it's, for instance, I think that, you know, if you're shooting like Cinestill 800T, and you're doing it in daylight, I mean, you can adjust it so that the white balance looks correct, but the colors in like skin tones, for instance, are going to be different. I mean,
Yeah.
they're not going to look like Portra.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would say like it's best to try to match the film that you're using with the results that you want. And I think that that does make a difference. Like if you want something super saturated, some really saturated blues, shoot, you know, Ektar instead of Portra. If you want really good skin tones, shoot Portra. If you want just kind of like a good colorful, you know, mix, you know, there's all different variants that you can do. Start with that, and your editing process will be a lot easier and a lot less, than if you went with the other. I mean, could you make Ektar look just like Portra? I mean, you could, maybe. I mean, it would be not exactly, but you could. I mean, you can build with like lookup tables and everything else. I mean, you can make, you know, could you make Portra all the colors exactly correct so that they look just like digital? I mean, you could, but do you want to? I mean, at that point, you know, I mean, you could.
All right, y'all. That's it for today. If you enjoyed the video, if you learned something, please go ahead and like the video, of course. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe. All right, y'all. To the next video. I'm out.